The big hangar was cold and smelled strongly of oil and old coffee machines. It was the kind of place that felt heavy and serious. The air was thick with the sound of loud drilling and the shouting of men giving orders across the large floor. Lydia sat at her small wooden desk in the far corner of the room. Her desk was very messy. It was covered in papers with long numbers and complex graphs. She was tired and her eyes burned from lack of sleep. She had been working for 14 hours straight, but she could not go home yet, not while the problem was still in her mind. She was staring hard at the large blueprint for the new fighter jet. It was a beautiful machine on paper. It had sleek lines and a powerful engine that looked ready to roar. The generals wanted it to go faster than sound. They wanted it to win the war and bring glory to the country. But Lydia saw something that no one else saw. She saw a ghost in the machine that was going to kill people. She had been checking the vibration data from the last secret test flight. The report said the plane had shaken so hard that the pilot almost passed out. The other engineers said the pilot was just weak and could not handle the speed. They said the plane was fine and strong. But Lydia knew better. She looked at the numbers on her page, and they told a different story. The tail of the plane was too stiff. When the wind hit it at high speed, it would wobble back and forth. That wobble would get bigger and bigger until the whole plane snapped in half. It was a simple problem with a deadly answer. She took a fresh piece of white paper and started to sketch with her pencil. Her hand moved fast across the page. She drew a new shape for the tail. It was not stiff and rigid like the old one. It was curved and flexible. It would move with the wind instead of fighting against it. It was a crazy idea that went against everything they taught in engineering school. But her math said it would work perfectly. She checked the numbers 3 times. Then she checked them a 4th time to be absolutely sure. It was perfect. It would save the plane, and it would save the pilot. She looked at the clock on the wall and realized it was very late. She put the drawing carefully into her folder and stood up to leave. Knowing tomorrow would be a difficult day, the morning sun blasted through the dirty windows of the hangar the next day, and the noise was even louder than before. Men in gray suits and blue jumpsuits were walking around, with clipboards looking busy and important. Lydia walked in with her head held high. She wore her work clothes and her hair was tied back tight to keep it out of her eyes. She looked for Mr. Thorne, who was the head engineer. He was a man who liked to hear his own voice and tell people what to do. He was standing by the big wooden table in the middle of the room. A group of younger engineers was standing around him, nodding at everything he said. Mr. Thorne was a big man with a red face and he was talking loudly about how great the plane was going to be. He did not know about the danger Lydia saw. Lydia walked up to the table, and the men stopped talking to look at her. Some of them smiled in a mean way because they did not think a woman should be telling them what to do. Mr. Thorne turned around and looked annoyed that she had interrupted him. He asked her what she wanted in a sharp voice. Lydia did not smile back. She put her folder on the table and opened it up. She took out the drawing of the new tail and put it right on top of the official blueprints. She told Mr. Thorne that the plane had a fatal flaw. She said the tail would break at high speed, and she said she had the solution. She pointed to her drawing and explained that the flexibility would stop the vibration before it got too bad. She spoke with confidence and strength because she knew the science was on her side. Thorne looked down at the paper on the table and squinted his eyes. He did not look at the math or the numbers she had written. He just looked at the shape and let out a loud laugh. It was a mean and mocking laugh that made the other men laugh with him. He picked up the drawing by the corner and waved it in the air like a flag and asked if this was a joke. He said the plane was built of strong steel, not rubber, and that a flexible tail would make the plane impossible to fly. He told her she did not understand how a real machine worked. He threw the paper back onto the table and told her to get back to her desk and do her real work. He said he did not have time for schoolgirl projects. Lydia felt a fire burn in her chest, and she stepped closer to the table. She told him to look at the data. She said the pilot would die if they did not fix it, and she said this was not about ego. It was about life and death. Mr. Thorne's face turned dark red with anger. He leaned over the table and pointed his finger in her face. He told her to watch her mouth. He said he was the chief engineer, and she was just a calculator. He grabbed her drawing and crumpled it into a tight ball and threw it across the room, where it hit the wall and fell into the dust. He turned his back on her and told the other men to get back to work. He said the flight test was scheduled for next week and nothing was going to change. That Lydia stood still for a long time while the room went back to its noisy, normal state. The men ignored her because they were afraid of Mr. Thorne and did not want to make him mad. Lydia looked at the crumpled ball of paper in the corner and felt a heavy weight in her stomach. But it was not fear, it was anger. It was a cold, hard anger that made her focus. She walked slowly across the room and picked up the ball of paper. She uncrumpled it carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles with her hand. The paper was messy, but the lines were still there, and the math was still true. She looked at Mr. Thorne, who was laughing loudly at a joke one of the men made. He did not care about the truth. He only cared about being the boss. Lydia knew she could not fight him with words anymore because he would never listen to her. She had to show him. She had to prove it. She walked back to her desk and sat down in her hard chair. She put the wrinkled drawing on her desk and put a heavy book on it to flatten it out. She looked out the window at the empty sky and knew the plane was going to fail unless she did something. She was not going to let the pilot die and she was not going to let Mr. Thorne win. She opened her notebook to a blank page and started to write a new plan. It was a risky plan and a dangerous plan, but it was the only way she was going to make sure her design flew, even if she had to do it herself. The days moved very slowly inside the big metal factory. The air always smelled like burned oil, and loud machines rang in everyone's ears. Lydia sat at her small desk in the corner, far away from the big windows where the light was good. She was trying to focus on her work, but her eyes kept looking up at the calendar on the wall. The red circle around the date was getting closer and closer. It was only 3 days away now. That was the day the big plane was supposed to fly. The plane that Lydia knew was going to break apart in the sky. She tried to talk to the other engineers, but they would just turn their backs on her when she walked by. They were scared of Mr. Thorne, and they did not want to lose their jobs. Mr. Thorne was like a dark cloud moving through the factory. He walked with his chest out and his hands behind his back, checking on everyone to make sure they were working hard. He never looked at Lydia if he could help it. He treated her like she was invisible, or like a piece of furniture that was in his way. Lydia spent her lunch breaks in the library, reading old books about wind and speed. She knew she was right about the tail of the plane. She had done the math hundreds of times. The numbers were simple and true, but she could not make Mr. Thorne see that. On Tuesday afternoon, she decided to try one more time. She saw Mr. Thorne standing near the coffee machine, drinking from his white ceramic cup. He looked relaxed and happy, which made Lydia feel even more worried because he had no idea what was coming. She walked up to him with her notebook in her hand. She asked him if he had just 5 minutes to look at the new safety numbers she had found. She promised she would be quick and she would not bother him again. After this, Mr. Thorne put his coffee cup down slowly on the counter and turned his whole body to face her. He looked at her with cold eyes and asked her why she could not just do her job and stop causing trouble. He said he was tired of her constant talking about things that did not matter. He told her that the plane was perfect and that the pilot was the best in the whole country. He said if there was a problem with the plane, the pilot would just fly better, and that was the end of it. Lydia felt her face get hot, but she did not look away. She opened her mouth to speak, but he just held up his hand to stop her. He told her to go back to her desk, and if she spoke about the tail one more time, he would take her badge and send her home for good. Lydia walked back to her desk, feeling like her legs were made of lead. She sat down and put her head in her hands. She felt small and helpless against him, but then she remembered the pilot. His name was Sam, and he had a kind face and a little girl who waited for him at home every night. Lydia could not let Sam fly that plane just because Mr. Thorne had a big ego. She waited until the clock on the wall hit 5 o'clock, and the factory floor started to empty out for the day. The loud machines were turned off one by one until it was quiet. Lydia did not leave. She stayed in her chair and pretended to be busy writing in her notebook. She watched the men leave through the big doors, laughing and talking about their dinner plans. Finally, she saw Mr. Thorne put on his coat and walk out the door with his briefcase in his hand. He did not even look back to see if anyone was still working. When she was sure the coast was clear, Lydia grabbed her bag and walked quickly but quietly towards the back of the factory. Her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She pushed through the heavy metal doors that led to the testing area. It was much darker here. The lights were turned off to save money, and the only light came from the high windows near the ceiling. The air was cold and smelled like old dust and metal shavings. She knew where the key was hidden because she had seen the janitor use it a few times. She reached under a loose floorboard near the shelf, and her fingers touched the cold metal of the key. She grabbed it and ran to the small door that led to the wind tunnel room. This room was where they tested the small models of the planes to see how they would handle the wind. She unlocked the door and slipped inside. Locking it behind her. The wind tunnel was a giant machine that looked like a long silver tube. It was silent now, but Lydia knew how loud it could get. She did not want to turn on the big machine, because the noise would bring the guards running. Instead, she went to the workbench where they kept the scale models of the planes. She looked through the shelves until she found the model for the new fighter jet. It was painted gray and looked fast and dangerous even just sitting there. Lydia took the model out of its stand and held it gently in her hands. It was smooth and cold. She put her bag on the table and took out her tools. She had a small file and some sandpaper and a tube of strong glue. She had spent the last 2 nights carving a new tail fin out of a piece of spare balsa wood. It was not perfect, but it was the right shape. She put the model in a clamp to hold it steady, and very carefully she used a small saw to cut the old stiff tail off the model. She felt bad for damaging the company property, but she knew she had to do it to save the real plane. She worked very fast. Her hands were shaking a little bit, but she told herself to be careful. She took her carved wooden tail and applied the glue to the base. She held it against the back of the model for a long time, counting the seconds in her head to make sure it would hold. While she waited, she looked around the dark room and felt a thrill go down her spine. She was actually doing it. She was changing the design to prove it worked. Once the glue was dry, she took the sandpaper and smoothed out the edges until the new tail looked like it belonged there. It was beautiful in a simple way. It was not rigid and stiff like the old one. It had a curve to it that looked like it wanted to dance with the wind. She stepped back and looked at her work. It was good. It was really good. Suddenly, she heard a heavy sound outside the door. It was the sound of boots walking on the concrete floor. Lydia froze. She held her breath and listened. The footsteps stopped right outside the wind tunnel door. She heard the handle rattle loudly. Someone was trying to get in. Lydia quickly grabbed the model and hid it behind a big box of spare parts on the shelf. She wiped her hands on her pants and tried to look calm. She walked to the door and unlocked it slowly, pulling it open just a crack. It was Mr. Thorne. He was standing there with a security guard and he looked very angry. He asked her what she was doing in there at this time of night. Lydia opened the door wider and stood up straight. She told him she had left her favorite pen in there earlier, and she came back to find it because her father gave it to her. Mr. Thorne looked past her into the dark room. He did not see anything wrong because the model was hidden. He told her she was not allowed in this room without permission, and that she should leave immediately. Before he called the police to have her arrested for trespassing. Lydia nodded her head and said she was sorry. She grabbed her bag and walked past him with her heart pounding in her chest. She did not look back until she was outside the factory gates, walking into the dark night. She knew she had only bought herself a little bit of time. Mr. Thorne was watching her now, and he would stop her if he knew what she was really planning. The next morning, Lydia came to work early, but her pass card did not work. When she tried to swipe it at the front gate, the little light turned red and made a buzzing sound. She tried again, but it would not open. The security guard in the booth looked at her and told her to wait a moment. He made a phone call and then looked at her with a sorry face. He told her that Mr. Thorne had called and said her access was suspended. He said she had to go home and wait for a call from Human Resources. Lydia looked through the tall fence at the factory buildings in the distance. She could see the top of the hangar where the real plane was waiting. She felt a tear run down her cheek, but she wiped it away quickly. She knew this was going to happen. She turned around and walked away from the gate, but she did not go home. She walked to the small diner across the street and sat in the corner booth with a cup of cold coffee. She took out a piece of paper and started to write a letter to Sam, the pilot. She had to find a way to warn him. She had to find a way to make him listen to her. Since she could not get into the factory anymore, she realized she had to find a different way to complete what no one else could. Lydia waited outside the small apartment building until the streetlights flickered off and the sun started to turn the sky a pale gray color. She knew Sam, the pilot, would be coming out soon to go to the base for his morning check. She had a cup of hot coffee in her hand to keep her warm, and she leaned against the brick wall, trying to look like she belonged there. When Sam walked out the front door, wearing his leather jacket and carrying his helmet, he stopped walking when he saw her. He looked confused and asked her why she was not at work. Lydia stood up straight and walked over to him. She did not waste any time with small talk. She told him that Mr. Thorne had suspended her and locked her out of the building. She said she knew the plane was going to crash, and she needed his help to stop it. Sam looked at her like she was crazy, but he could see the fear in her eyes. She took the small carved wooden model out of her bag and showed it to him. She pointed to the tail and explained how the stiffness would snap the plane apart at high speed. She told him she had a plan to fix the real plane, but they had to do it right now, before the officials arrived for the test flight. Sam looked at the model and then at his watch. He hesitated for a long minute because he knew he could get in a lot of trouble, but he was a good man, and he did not want to die in a crash that could have been prevented. He finally nodded his head and told her to get into his truck. They drove the long way around the base to avoid the main gate, where the guards knew Sam parked his truck near a hole in the chain link fence that only the ground crew knew about. They squeezed through the fence and ran across the wet grass towards the hangar. The fog was very thick that morning. It covered the runway like a thick white blanket and muffled every sound. They could not see the tops of the buildings, only the vague shapes of them looming in the gray mist. It was perfect weather for a secret mission, because nobody could see them moving across the tarmac. Sam used his key card to open the side door of the hangar, and they slipped inside. The huge space was quiet and dark. The big airplane sat in the middle of the floor, like a sleeping silver giant. The air smelled of cold metal and hydraulic fluid. Lydia felt a surge of adrenaline as she looked at the machine. She ran to her workbench. Even though she was locked out of the computer system, she had kept a physical set of her tools and her notes hidden under a loose floorboard. She pulled them out and grabbed a wrench and a bag of metal shims. She climbed up the portable ladder, and Sam followed her to the tail of the plane. Lydia worked faster than she had ever worked in her life. Her hands were moving with precision and speed. She explained to Sam that they needed to loosen the bolts on the tail rudder just enough to give it the flex she designed. It was not a perfect fix because they did not have time to build a whole new part, but it would be enough to prove the theory. Sam helped her by turning the heavy bolts while she held the gauge to measure the tension. The metal was cold and smelled of oil. As they worked, the silence of the hangar was broken only by the clinking of metal on metal and their heavy breathing. Lydia could feel the sweat running down her back. Even though it was freezing inside the building, she kept checking the door to make sure nobody was coming. She knew it was only a matter of time before the security guards did their morning rounds. Just as Lydia was tightening the last bolt, she saw flashing red lights sweep across the wall of the hangar. A car was driving fast towards the building, and the headlights cut through the fog like knives. Lydia froze for a second and then told Sam to start the engines immediately. Sam jumped down from the ladder and ran to the cockpit. Lydia slid down the ladder and ran to the ground crew panel to turn on the auxiliary power as the engines began to spin up. A low whining sound filled the air that grew into a loud roar. The hangar doors were still closed, and the wind from the engine started to blow tools and papers across the floor. The big doors began to slide open slowly, but before they were fully open, black car drove right onto the hangar floor. It was Mr. Thorne. He had seen the lights from the main road, and he came to investigate. He slammed on his brakes and got out of the car, leaving his door open. He was screaming something, but they could not hear him over the noise of the jet engine. Thorne was red-faced and furious. He ran towards the ladder, but the exhaust from the engine was too hot, and he had to shield his face. He saw Lydia standing near the wing, and he pointed his finger at her. He was shouting that she was fired and that she was going to prison for sabotaging the aircraft. He tried to run around the blast of air to get to the cockpit, but the wind was too strong. It was pushing him back. Lydia looked at him and felt a moment of pity, but she knew she could not stop now. She signaled to Sam to release the brakes. The big plane began to roll forward. Slowly, it crept out of the hangar into the thick white fog. Mr. Thorne ran back to his car and floored the gas pedal. He spun the car around and raced down the service road to get to the runway. He knew he had to block them before they could take a flight. He climbed into the cockpit and sat in the seat behind Sam. She put on her headset and strapped herself in tight. The plane was moving faster now, taxiing towards the active runway. The fog was so thick, they could barely see the runway lights. Sam was nervous. His hands were gripping the controls tightly, but he trusted Lydia and he trusted the machine. Suddenly, Lydia saw the headlights of Mr. Thorne's car cutting across the grass ahead of them. He drove his car right onto the middle of the runway and blocked the path. He slammed on the brakes and got out, waving his arms wildly over his head, screaming at them to stop. Sam pulled back on the throttle to slow down and looked at Lydia. He asked her what they should do. Lydia looked at the man standing in front of the plane, and then she looked at the instrument panel. She knew the plane had enough power to take off in the short distance left. She leaned forward and spoke into the microphone with a calm and steady voice. She told Sam not to stop. She told him to push the throttle to full power and go right over him. Sam hesitated for a fraction of a second, and then he pushed the throttle forward all the way. The engine screamed like a banshee and the plane surged forward violently. The force pushed Lydia back into her seat. Mr. Thorne saw the plane coming right at him and realized at the last second that they were not going to stop. He dove off the runway and rolled into the muddy grass just as the landing gear passed inches above his head. The plane lifted off the ground smoothly and climbed up into the sky, leaving the angry man and his car far below on the ground. Lydia looked out the window as they broke through the top of the fog layer. The sun was shining bright up here, and the sky was a deep blue. They had made it. They were in the air, and there was nothing Mr. Thorne could do to stop them now. The wheels left the ground, and the heavy gray fog swallowed the world below them. The roar of the jet engine filled the headset, making it hard to think clearly. Lydia gripped the edge of her seat until her knuckles turned white. Sam was flying the plane with a steady hand, but she could see the sweat on his forehead. He was taking a huge risk by being up here with her. If they crashed, he would lose his license and his life. The plane was heavy with fuel, and it climbed slowly. The air was turbulent, and the little plane bumped around in the rough wind currents. Lydia looked out the side window and saw nothing but gray mist. It felt like they were flying inside a cloud of thick wool. Sam asked her if she was ready to start the test. Lydia took a deep breath and checked her clipboard one last time. She told him to level off at 20,000 feet and prepare for the run. She felt a mix of terror and excitement. This was the moment she had worked for her whole life. This was the reason. She stayed late at night and ignored the people who doubted her as they climbed higher. The gray fog suddenly disappeared, and the blue sky opened up above them. It was bright and beautiful, and the sun was blinding. The turbulence stopped, and the plane rode smoothly. Sam leveled the plane off, and the engine settled into a steady hum. Lydia looked at the instruments. Everything was in the green zone. She told Sam to begin the acceleration run. She wanted to push the plane to the limit where the vibration would start. Sam nodded and pushed the throttle forward. The plane jumped forward and the speed needle began to climb steadily. The air rushing past the windows became a loud whistle. Lydia watched the vertical speed gauge intently. She knew that at around 400 miles per hour the tail would start to buffet. They were getting close to the danger zone as suddenly, the plane began to shake. It started as a small shiver in the control stick, like a phone vibrating on a table. Sam looked at her with wide eyes. The shaking got worse very quickly. It felt like the whole plane was being shaken by a giant hand. The rivets in the fuselage rattled, and the instrument panel blurred so much that Lydia could not read the numbers. Sam asked her what was happening. He sounded scared. The vibration was so bad that his voice was shaking up and down. Lydia forced herself to breathe slowly. She knew this was normal for this plane at this speed, but she also knew it would get worse, unless the new tail design worked. She told Sam to hold the course steady and not to fight the stick. She told him to trust her work. The shaking became violent. The noise was deafening. It sounded like the plane was coming apart. Sam had to use both hands to keep the wings level. The plane was bouncing up and down so hard that Lydia felt sick to her stomach. She saw the speed gauge hit the red line. This was the speed where the other test plane had crashed. The shaking was at its peak. The whole world was a blur of blue sky and rattling metal. Lydia thought about Mr. Thorne down on the ground. She knew he would be watching the radar trace, waiting for it to disappear. Lydia leaned forward and shouted into the microphone over the noise. She told Sam to engage the rudder modification. She told him to push the pedal down and hold it. There, Sam did not hesitate. He pushed his foot down on the rudder pedal. The extra slack they had put into the linkage allowed the tail to move just enough to catch the airflow differently. For a second, the shaking got even worse, and Lydia thought she had made a mistake. She felt her heart stop in her chest. But then suddenly, the violence stopped. It was like magic. One moment, the plane was shaking itself to pieces, and the next moment it was smooth as glass. The engine roar settled into a low hum, and the ride became perfectly steady. Sam looked at the instruments in disbelief. The speed needle was still climbing past the red line, but the plane was flying straight and true. It was cutting through the air like a knife. Lydia let out a breath she did not know she was holding. She looked at Sam and saw him smiling. He pushed the throttle even further, and the plane accelerated even faster. They were flying faster than any propeller plane had ever gone before. The wings were solid, and the tail was steady. The flex in the structure was absorbing the stress, instead of braking against it. Lydia looked down at the ground far below them through a break in the clouds. She knew that down there Mr. Thorne was probably screaming at the radar operators, demanding to know why the plane had not fallen out of the sky. She imagined him looking at the data in confusion, unable to understand how they had survived. The plane performed perfectly. For the next 20 minutes they tested different turns and climbs, and every time, the tail handled the air pressure exactly the way Lydia had calculated. It was not just a stable flight, it was a masterpiece of engineering. Lydia felt a profound sense of peace. She had done it. She had proven the theory was right, and she had saved Sam from the crash that was supposed to happen. Sam banked the plane gently to the left and pointed the nose back towards the base. He told her over the radio that it was the best plane he had ever flown, and that she was a genius. Lydia smiled and looked at the blue horizon. She knew they still had to land and face the consequences of stealing the plane, but she also knew that no one could argue with the data they were bringing back. The truth was in the air, and it could not be denied. The big silver bird glided silently through the air as Sam pointed the nose down towards the earth. The blue sky that had been their home for the last hour was fading back into the dull gray of the lower atmosphere. Lydia kept her eyes on the instruments. Watching the altimeter count down, she felt a strange mix of relief and heavy dread. The flight had been a perfect success, but she knew that waiting for them on the ground was a very angry man with a lot of power. Sam keyed the microphone and called the tower to ask for landing clearance, but the radio was filled with static, and nobody answered back. Sam looked at Lydia and told her that the silence was expected, and that they should just get the plane on the ground safely. They dropped below the cloud layer. The runway appeared in the distance. It looked like a long gray strip of concrete cutting through the green grass. Lydia could see a line of black cars parked near the control tower with their red lights flashing in the morning air. She could see a crowd of people standing on the tarmac, and right in the middle of them was Mr. Thorne. He was looking up at the sky with his hands on his hips and his face red with anticipation. Lydia was sure that he was expecting to see a smoking hole in the ground. Instead of a plane flying smoothly, Sam brought the wheels down and locked them in place. The plane made a loud screeching noise as the tires touched the concrete runway. It bounced once and then settled down, rolling fast towards. The group of Peoplism applied the brakes and the plane slowed down, turning off the runway and taxiing towards the hangar. The engine spooled down and the roar faded into a quiet whistle. The propeller stopped spinning and a heavy silence fell over the airfield. Lydia unstrapped her harness and opened the hatch. She jumped down to the tarmac and felt her legs wobble a little bit from the long stress of the flight. Sam climbed down behind her and patted her on the shoulder, telling her she did good. Mr. Thorne came storming over. His face was purple with rage, and he was shouting so loudly that spittle flew from his mouth. He was screaming that they were both going to prison for a long time. He called them criminals and idiots, and said they had destroyed a multi-million-dollar machine. He pointed at the tail of the plane, expecting to see it cracked or broken, but when he looked closely, he saw it was perfectly intact. Thorne stopped shouting for a moment and looked confused. He looked at the tail and saw the marks from the wrenches and the slight adjustment they had made. He asked Sam what he had done to the plane. Sam stepped forward and stood right next to Lydia. He told Mr. Thorne that he did not do anything, and that the plane was still in one piece because of Lydia. Sam reached into the cockpit and pulled out the flight data log, which showed the speed they had reached and the time they spent in the air. He handed the paper to Mr. Thorne. Mr. Thorne looked at the paper, and his eyes went wide. He looked at the speed number, then he looked at the plane, and then he looked at Lydia. He shook his head in denial and said it was impossible, that the machine was faulty, and they just got lucky. Just then a big black car pulled up fast, and a man in a high military uniform stepped out, followed by two other generals. They walked over to the group with serious faces. Mr. Thorne tried to compose himself and straightened his tie. He started to tell the general that Lydia was a dangerous saboteur who stole the plane and put lives at risk. But the general held up his hand to stop him from speaking. The general had been watching the radar tracking and the speed readout from his own office in the tower. He walked right past Mr. Thorne and stood in front of Lydia. He asked her if the plane really went that fast. Lydia nodded her head and said yes, it did. And she explained that the tail needed to move with the wind, not against it. She spoke clearly and confidently. Unlike Mr. Thorne, who was sweating and stammering, the generals looked at the data and then walked around the plane inspecting the structure. They patted the metal skin and looked impressed. They knew that their current planes could not handle that kind of speed without shaking apart. The head general turned to Mr. Thorne and asked him why this modification was not in the original plans. Mr. Thorne had no answer. He stood there with his mouth open, looking like a fish out of water. The general then turned back to Lydia and told her that she did a good job. He said the Air Force needed engineers who could solve problems, not people who just followed old rules. He told Mr. Thorne to go back to his office and wait for a disciplinary hearing. Thorne walked away with his head down, looking defeated and small. Lydia watched him go and felt a giant weight lift off her shoulders. It was over. She had won. Sam shook her hand and told her she was a hero. The crowd of mechanics and ground crew, who had been watching, started to clap slowly and then louder, until the whole airfield was cheering. Lydia looked at the plane and then at the sky. She felt a sense of pride that she had never felt before. It was not just about winning an argument. It was about being right and proving that she belonged there. She had completed what no one else could do. She had taken a broken design and made it fly faster than sound. Later that evening, Lydia sat in the same small diner where she had written her letter to Sam. She had a cup of tea and a piece of pie. She watched the sun go down through the window, painting the sky in orange and pink colors. She knew that tomorrow would be a busy day with meetings and interviews and probably more arguments. But tonight she was just going to sit and enjoy the quiet. She took out her notebook and turned to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote a new title for her next project. She was not afraid anymore, because she knew that if she had a good idea and worked hard enough, she could make it happen, no matter who tried to stand in her way. She smiled and took a sip of her tea, ready for whatever came next.